Welcome to the third of our 6 panels on COVID and the law. I'm Eugene Meyer, president of the Federalist Society, and we are delighted to be having this series covering federal and state roles, covering regulation, covering elections, covering civil liberties. This is the panel on federal executive power, and I'm going to want to introduce our moderator, who will also be a substantive participant. So I wanted to stress that. Our moderator is Gary Lawson, a professor of law at Boston University, also on the board of the Federalist Society. Gary, take it away.
Thank you all for being here. As is true of all of the other panels, we do have a truly extraordinary group. The biographies of our panelists are available on the Federalist Society website. I strongly encourage you at some point, not right this instant, but at some point to take a look at those. These are very interesting and impressive biographies. We're particularly happy to have a panel of people with expertise and experience with disasters. We have Professor Lisa Gross-Sun, who, along with Dan Farber, who was on a previous panel, is co-author of a casebook on disaster law. We have Boyden Gray, who for 4 decades has been embroiled with the regulatory state. That's about as good an experience of disaster management as you'll ever find. If anyone can top that, it's Dan Rodriguez, who has twice been a law school dean. That's the academic equivalent of being a storm chaser. We're going to hear from our speakers in that order. And then, as Jean said, I'm going to double dip both as a moderator and as a participant. So with no further ado, Lisa.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm privileged to kick off this panel with some general background about executive power to respond to disasters like the COVID-19 pandemic, and then I'm going to give some preliminary thoughts about the administration's response. Congress has delegated lots of authority to the president to respond to public health emergencies. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 such sources of executive statutory authority: the Public Health Service Act, the Stafford Act, and the Defense Production Act. The Public Health Service Act gives the Secretary of Health and Human Services, currently Alex Azar, broad authority to respond to public health disasters upon the declaration of a public health emergency, including authority to deploy federal agencies like the CDC and the NIH, to make grants, conduct investigations, and enter into contracts. It also authorizes the establishment of international and interstate quarantine and grants some limited power over intrastate quarantine. The Act also authorizes maintenance of the Strategic National Stockpile. And additionally, once a public health emergency is declared under this Act, federal law also provides for the waiver of a wide variety of regulatory requirements, including, for example, some FDA rules. Secretary Azar declared a public health emergency for COVID-19 under this Act on January 31st. Our next statute is the Stafford Act, which is the primary statutory framework through which the federal government provides aid to states and localities when natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, or floods overwhelm local capacity to respond. The Stafford Act authorizes 2 types of declarations that allow the president and FEMA to coordinate relief efforts and funnel resources to affected areas: major disaster declarations and emergency declarations. President Trump's use of his Stafford Act authorities during the COVID-19 pandemic has been unprecedented in several respects. First, it marks the first time a major disaster declaration has been used for a pandemic. The Stafford Act authorizes the president to declare a major disaster upon a request by a state governor or tribal leader when any natural catastrophe causes damage of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant federal assistance to supplement state and local efforts. While the statute lists many disasters that can count as natural catastrophes, the list doesn't specifically mention pandemics, so there has long been debate about whether a pandemic can trigger a major disaster declaration. President Trump concluded that pandemics can qualify when he issued a COVID-19 major disaster declaration for New York on March 20th. By April 11th, every state and territory in the Union had a COVID-19 disaster declaration, which marks another first for the Stafford Act, the first time all states have had major disaster declarations at the same time for the same disaster. The president has also used his authority to declare Stafford Act emergencies in unprecedented ways. On March 13th, President Trump unilaterally declared a nationwide Stafford Act emergency for COVID-19 without waiting for requests from individual states. Because Stafford Act aid is intended to help when local resources are insufficient, all major disaster declarations and most emergency declarations must be requested by the affected state, tribe, or territory. The president does, however, have power under Section 501B of the Stafford Act to unilaterally declare an emergency without state request when the president determines that the federal government has primary responsibility for the emergency because the subject area is one for which the federal government exercises exclusive or preeminent responsibility and authority. This power to unilaterally declare a uniquely federal emergency has previously been exercised only when federal property has been destroyed or attacked, such as in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. It's never before been used on a national scale or for an incident over which states have so much response authority. In declaring the COVID-19 emergency, President Trump asserted that only the federal government can provide the necessary coordination to address a pandemic of this national size and scope, and that it's the preeminent responsibility of the federal government to take action to stem a nationwide pandemic that had its origins abroad. Even after a Stafford Act emergency or disaster is declared, the president has discretion over which, if any, of the Act's powers and resources to deploy. It's a little bit hard to get a handle on exactly what the federal government has done with its Stafford Act authority, but some things include providing reimbursement to states for personal protective equipment, PPE, using the Army Corps of Engineers to construct alternative care sites, and providing crisis counseling services in some states. The act would also give the president authority to do things like distribute food, medicine, and other supplies, including seizing needed supplies from private parties, and providing additional aid to individuals and households, including housing assistance, unemployment benefits, and financial assistance with medical expenses. The Defense Production Act is one of those emergency statutes that even most disaster law experts didn't know much about before the COVID-19 crisis. Title I of the Act allows the president, as deemed appropriate to promote national defense, to require companies to accept and prioritize government contracts for materials and services, including, for example, PPE and ventilators, and allocate or control the general distribution of materials. Title III of the DPA is focused on presidential authority to expand production capacity and supply. It allows the president to provide economic incentives to increase domestic supply, including loans, loan guarantees, direct purchases, and purchase commitments. For the few minutes I have remaining, I want to share some preliminary thoughts on the administration's response. First, on preparation and leadership. In judging the adequacy of executive response, we also need to consider what came before, because mitigation and preparedness play critical roles in how effective response can be. It's clear that in many respects, we were seriously unprepared for a pandemic of this magnitude, and that's really not a surprise, and there's plenty of blame to go around. The Strategic National Stockpile, for instance, has been chronically underfunded, especially if we wanted it to function as a resource for a nationwide pandemic rather than just for more regional disasters. But it's also true that the Trump administration halted some of the momentum the Obama administration built during the Ebola crisis. For example, in May 2018, National Security Advisor John Bolton dissolved the National Security Council's Office of Global Health Security, cut some staff, and folded its responsibilities into the new NSC Counterproliferation and Biodefense Directorate, which has jurisdiction over arms control and nonproliferation, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and global health and biodefense. This move potentially also suggests that when response for so-called natural disasters like pandemics is folded into agencies or directorates that are also tasked with national defense and terrorism response, that natural disaster response tends to be neglected and overshadowed by these other mandates. This seems to have been a major factor in the bungled federal response to Hurricane Katrina after FEMA was folded into the newly created Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. Katrina also demonstrated the need to have federal officials in charge who have real on-the-ground emergency management experience. Second, another potential critique of the administration centers on the lack of federal coordination. We knew in early January and February, as we watched the pandemic playing out in other countries, that we probably had insufficient PPE, maybe ventilators, et cetera, in the country and in the national stockpile. We also knew that there was a critical need to develop testing and contact tracing capacity. We could imagine a federal government taking charge of solving this problem by coordinating sourcing of PPE and ventilators. Could also have made greater use of the DPA to prioritize contracts or to provide loans and purchase guarantees. Instead, the administration told states they were largely on their own, and the subsequent scrambling of states to purchase limited reserves drove up prices and created bidding wars between states and even arguably between states and the federal government. The president's assertion in declaring that Stafford Act emergency that only the federal government could provide the needed coordination to deal with this pandemic contrasts sharply with his later insistence that states have primary responsibility for pandemic response, even in areas where the absence of federal coordination results in these kind of state bidding wars. How much harm is this failure of coordination done? It could be substantial, but this assessment really turns in part on how well and competently the administration would have done at things like sourcing and distributing equipment like PPE. We know that federal coordination and centralization can be problematic. See, for example, the insistence early on that all private labs use the flawed CDC test for COVID-19 testing. I'm not confident that federal coordination would have been better, in part because of the president's own suggestion that distribution wouldn't be based on clear need or other reasonable criteria, but at least somewhat on which state governors express sufficient support for administration policies. And this really leads to my last critique about disinformation and lack of transparency. The president consistently denied the seriousness of the disease during the first month and a half or so, and largely squandered that valuable time in which we could have been sourcing PPE and developing testing and tracking capacity that could have helped limit deaths and also might have lessened the need for stay-at-home orders and lockdowns. Moreover, we've really observed a serious lack of transparency in the way that the Trump administration is conducting response. Transparency is definitely no panacea, but it's particularly critical in disasters for a number of reasons, including the fact that once a disaster or emergency is declared, there's a lot of government discretion at play over the response. Many of the normal rules that guide and limit, for example, government contracting go out the window. That means that often the only real check on these processes is political accountability. Trump's own words give us some reason to doubt that medical equipment is being distributed according to reasonable criteria like need, but it's really been difficult to get information about where supplies are going and why. Operation Airbridge, in which the federal government was chartering planes to bring medical supplies to the US, really operated without very much transparency. Likewise, I think we need increased transparency around programs like Operation Warp Speed, designed to speed vaccine development. And ultimately, we will need to have clear and established transparent criteria about how the vaccines are going to be distributed. So those are some of my initial thoughts. Looking forward to hearing the rest of the panelists.
All right, thanks so much. I should have said at the outset that once the panelists are done, I'll give instructions on how members of the audience can get in line for questions. But we'll hear from the panelists first. Boyden.
Thank you. That was a brilliant litany of the powers that emergency and otherwise that the federal government has. What I want to do is raise questions about whether all of these powers are inhibited, diluted, undercut by one profound and fundamental characteristic of the administrative state, which is the rather unseemly combination of big bureaucracy with big business, arising out of something that Adam Smith worried about. Academics have written about. It's well understood as an academic discipline called agency capture, public choice theory. And this has been a growing problem that Gary identified a decade or more than that ago, and it's only gotten worse. It hasn't gotten any better. And it is a real, I think, obstacle to doing things correctly. Now, what it amounts to is, again, the capture of regulatory authority in a given agency by the industry that's supposed to be regulated. It's exacerbated by the revolving door because the people who want to leave after 20 years in the agencies and make enough money to educate their children and grandchildren naturally gravitate towards the most powerful and richest of the deep pocketed of the of the agencies they were regulating. And this is true, affects the Congress as well. I could give you examples. The opioid crisis would be one. You could also look at Boeing and the FAA and the 737 being another. My favorite one, which has an impact, and I'll use it to begin a discussion of how this affects the response, has been the backfiring of the Dodd-Frank law, which was adopted to stop abuses or bigness by the big banks, but ended up only making them bigger and stronger, and their regulatory agencies bigger and stronger, tripling their share of GDP in the process, and crushing community banks, which have been the major source of capital for small business outside of the smaller world of venture capital for high tech out in Silicon Valley, but a very, very important source. And how has that affected COVID? Well, it has taken away a source of release of the massive amounts of money that have been appropriated to help small business. If the community banks existed at the level they were 15,000 or so before the market crash in 2008, it's now probably less than half that. A lot of consolidation, and small business has had a terrible time getting access to their rightful share of this, and there's been a lot of corruption and a lot of favoritism, all of which is characteristic of this administrative state problem. And so the stimulus package, the recovery package, has been severely, I think, compromised by the characteristics of the administrative state and the banking industry's skewed relationships as a result of these high barriers to entry. Jamie Dimon refers to Dodd-Frank as his moat, chairman of JP Morgan, and by that he means not his MOTE in his eye, he means MOAT around his castle, freezing out competition and freezing in, therefore, the sort of inbred favoritism that exists. On I think a more serious level, you see in the reaction of the CDC and the FDA, you see the common characteristics of the rigidity and ossification of the regulatory state, and it's simply inexcusable that the CDC was not ready, and it still hasn't conquered it, ready with testing, which has been the most glaring failure of the permanent bureaucracy to provide for the common good. This is not something you can blame any White House on. They don't have experts at manufacturing testing kits. This is something the CDC should have been on top of, and should have been ready to pick up the German tests, which was ready within weeks at the time, maybe even quicker than that. But instead, they were protecting their own entrenched suppliers, and I think may still be doing so. When it comes to the FDA, they have been shaken up a lot by this, but there's a lot further to go. They have allowed, I think, to take one example, which is well known and quite controversial, but I think it's worth talking about. It's a drug called hydroxychloroquine, and it's something that the president mistakenly, in my view, promoted because it polarized and provided a lot of opposition to it, which had nothing to do with the scientific merits, had everything to do with politics. And so a lot of the mainstream media piled on, just doing everything they could to destroy the reputation and facts around this particular drug, which is not a miracle. It doesn't prevent the disease. It's not a vaccine. But I do believe it could be a great help, like Tamiflu, which is good to reduce the severity of illness if given early in the course of disease. There has been a lot of good study, a lot of good work done, not just in this country, but in France, which was all hidden, denied by the FDA itself, and denied by the mainstream media. And so we don't really know how effective this could be, because the rules about its testing have been by the FDA limited to hospital trials. And the point is that this drug, if it's useful, is best deployed before someone is in the hospital. By that time, it's almost too late. And so the difficulty has been a characteristic rejection of freedom of competition, and the big pharma companies, regrettably, have not helped. Have tried to limit access and attention to drugs prepared by them, and not some 60-year-old, well understood, very safe, off-label use a drug at 10 cents a pill. And I'll stop there and say that has, I think, inhibited the competitive transparency that the previous speaker spoke so well of.
Thanks so much, Boyden. Dean?
Thank you, Gary. Hold on, I'm just getting my watch ready here. Actually, I'll leave it to you to call it's time. Thank you for this invitation. I really benefited and profited from hearing this before. I want to talk, even though this is a panel on executive power, and I'm well aware of that, I actually want to focus my remarks on Congress and congressional failure, and I promise I'll at least do my best to try to tie these themes together. Those of us who consume maybe altogether too much the media and think about these issues from our various perspectives are consumed by frustrations with the actions or inactions of the executive branch to a greater or lesser degree, what the president on behalf of the executive branch has done, or in particular, as Lisa pointed out, has not done. Many of us are frustrated by various actions of state governments, our own state governments, or the state governors generally. That's the conversation about lockdowns and reopenings at all. And certainly frustrations with the courts and the actions of the courts there too, what they've done and not done. And what's missing at some fundamental level, though, is where I want to turn our attention to, and that is the role and the absent role of Congress. Now, Lisa quite rightly and eloquently spelled out the linchpin of congressional action in this regard. That is generally with respect to emergencies and health emergencies in particular, sort of the kind of the big three blockbuster statutes that she touched on, the Public Health Service Act, right, dating back from the 1940s, the Defense Production Act, enacted a few years later, and the Stafford Act. But I want to suggest that notwithstanding these framework statutes, Congress's actions have been largely inadequate. And I mean this in two distinct senses, although they overlap with one another. They've been adequate with respect to COVID-19 in particular, in dealing with the health aspects, the public health aspects, and also the economic aspects. But second, and in some ways more interesting because it sheds light on these broader issues, is the statutory frameworks for dealing with pandemics, health emergencies in particular, is not where we need it to be. Now, on the first point, just to emphasize here the glass as being half full rather than half empty, maybe more than half full, it should be acknowledged, and you don't need me to acknowledge it, that Congress did snap into action to a very significant extent with respect to many of the economic consequences. Who'd have thought that the first foray, more than a foray, first important action, which was providing $8 billion to help emergency workers and health workers, would soon thereafter turn into a $2.2 trillion statute, a CARES Act. And we could quarrel or quibble about the adequacy or inadequacy of that response, but let's give credit where credit's due for the bipartisan effort on the part of Congress to allocate real money. So that's a caveat in some ways, but notwithstanding that, I want to suggest that there has been congressional inaction, and I'd say more provocatively, congressional failure, and that bears on the executive branch's role in this respect. First, let me say why this is a problem. Why is it a problem? Again, recurring to Lisa's comments, many of the statutes, the key statutes, in particular the Stafford Act and the Public Health Services Act, reflect significant delegation of authority, not surprisingly. And in some ways, not problematically, to the executive branch to make many of these fundamental decisions. We might think of Congress as aiding and abetting, in a good way, the actions of the executive branch, not simply the White House, qua White House, but executive agencies that she mentioned, HHS et al. And to a great extent, also aiding and abetting the actions and the work of the state governments. That's how it's supposed to work, right? The providing support, not simply in the form of money, but in the form of authority. So let's not neglect that. Let's also not neglect, and this actually bears a little, I think, to some extent on Boyden's comments, the broad delegation, and in many respects, maybe the limitless delegation of authority given to the executive branch to actually enact rules and regulations, which is why, remarkably, we can say in 2020, it remains an open question about the White House's authority to compel lockdowns and shutdowns, or to issue instructions for reopenings. That remains an open question, is a remarkable thing, given how profoundly important those issues are. And that I suggest really is a matter of congressional, not so much acquiescence, but congressional vacuum. Maybe they hadn't thought of it, but maybe more plausibly, this was a can kicked down the proverbial road when Congress enacted the Public Service Act in 1944, which sounds like a long time ago. In some ways, it is, but this was 40 years after, 30 plus years after an enormous number of epidemics and pandemics, smallpox and the like. So nature abhors a vacuum. And we lack a public health strategy at the federal congressional level, notwithstanding the existence of some statutes. We lack both a framework and a strategy. What can Congress provide it? Not to be Pollyannish about Congress in reality or even in theory. Congress can uniquely provide and collect information and mobilize information for use and utility of the executive branch, agencies, and also state governments. Congress has, needless to say, control over the budget, its allocation, and its oversight thereby, not to mention control to a greater or lesser degree over agencies and exercising that authority. And they have a significant role to play in local and regional matters, not so much because of their power and authority per se, but because of the fact that, to look at it in a fairly prosaic way, Congress is made up of 535 elected representatives, 100 of which are elected at the state level, and 435 of which are elected in single-member districts. So even in the case of a pandemic, whereas, as the saying goes, it's borderless, since the borders do not respect contagion and disease. Nonetheless, there are unique circumstances in particular states, in particular localities, and Congress as an institution is, if any institution, federal government, supposed to be suited, and indeed well suited, to take account of these considerations. So let's say that congressional failure is a significant failure of strategy. Let me be a little more particular, since what I've been saying now has been rather polemic. What could Congress do aside from its significant economic investments, which again, I would suggest should not be, and I don't mean to take for granted? I can think of three categories, but if we had longer time, I suppose that three could turn into 33, but let me mention them briefly. Number one, testing and tracing. This is about providing allocation of money, but it's also strategy, ranging from the use of technology, surveillance, compensation for tracers. The implementation of testing is certainly something in the wheelhouse of Congress, if any institution. Second, issues that are enormously complex and difficult about liability in the employment context and for consumers, immunity, which is an issue. Those are issues for Congress. The executive branch certainly lacks the authority to give broad immunity to individuals and employers for injuries connected with COVID-19. And lastly, we're gonna get a vaccine one of these days, hopefully soon one of these days. And the allocation distribution of the vaccine and treatment is going to fundamentally involve significant decisions of the federal government, and Congress could provide some leadership in that respect. So let me just bring this to a conclusion by answering your question. What does this have to do with executive power? It has to do with executive power because fundamentally Congress needs to be at the fulcrum of cooperation and collaboration with the executive branch. And once again, without minimizing the impact of the Stafford Act, Public Health Service Act, and the Defense Production Act, there still is a vacuum of leadership demonstrated by the relative inaction on the part of Congress thus far that leaves the executive branch, if not at sea, then with inadequate steps and strategies to undertake this. So this is not an abdication of responsibility on the part of the Trump administration, but simply an acknowledgement that part of our fundamental federal regulatory structure involves a significant and ought to involve a much more significant role of Congress than has heretofore been demonstrated.
Thanks so much, Dan. Now, no one should be a judge in their own cause, but I am actually going to time myself. And since I'm pretty brutal as a timekeeper, I'm not going to tempt myself on this. Regardless of what institution of government you focus on, whether it's federal or state, executive, legislative, so far the decisions regarding COVID-19 have all been cloaked in the mantle of expertise. Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx have been as visible at White House press conferences as Donald Trump and Mike Pence. And Joe Biden's website says, quote, "In a moment of crisis, leadership requires listening to experts and communicating credible information to the American public." Now think about that for a moment. Good leadership involves being a transmission belt from the experts to the public. Pretty much every state governor and member of Congress and state legislator says much the same thing. Not all that surprising. This is the spectacular triumph of the progressive era theory of government that has been dominant for the past 150 years. Government by experts has been a steady mantra for that entire time. It's not surprising that by 2020, it's the experts running the show. Well, who could possibly be against that, right? After all, if the choice is experts, politicians, or deplorables, who would ever choose anyone other than the experts? Don't we all rely on experts in our daily lives? Why should a government response to a medical crisis be anything different? Well, my aim today is not to answer those questions, to criticize any particular experts or politicians who have relied on those experts, or to prescribe a policy for dealing with anything. Instead, I want to put all of these questions into a larger context because they're just the tip of an Antarctic-sized iceberg involving the role of experts, not just in government, but in life. Just within law, we have distorted the constitutional structure beyond recognition in the name of expertise. The law of evidence has turned itself inside out to accommodate expert witnesses. As I've just indicated, executive officials have redefined their roles as being the faithful agents doing the bidding of experts. We need to take a close, hard look at the basic concept of expertise. And the specific question I want to pose, and it is a question I don't have the answers, is how can non-experts evaluate experts? How can a non-expert know when to call upon experts, which experts to call upon, how much to rely on them, and how to evaluate their work product? Right? Again, these questions go well beyond law and government. My modest task here is to present a framework for non-experts to employ in posing these questions. So the first question is whether the problem at hand, whatever it is, exceeds the non-expert's own knowledge. And that's not as easy to figure out as it sounds. How do you know that a task exceeds your cognitive ability if you don't have, or maybe even don't understand, the kind of information and skills necessary to perform the task? How do you know what you don't know? And more importantly, how important the missing information is relative to the information or knowledge that you have. Now, these are philosophical and epistemological problems, not distinctly legal problems, but they are universal and they affect the law as well as everything else. Second question is whether gaps in your knowledge, once you've identified them, can be filled in by experts, which will not always be so. The fact that You don't know what you need to know does not mean that someone else will necessarily know what you need to know just by virtue of different knowledge or training. A gap in knowledge does not lead inexorably to deference to experts. You need good reasons to think that the expertise, even in principle, is relevant to the task at hand. Here's an example. Suppose the question is whether to impose economic costs of magnitude X on some people in order to gain health benefits of magnitude Y for other people. What kind of expertise, even in principle, would be relevant for that kind of decision? Now, it's possible that expertise would go into the determination of the magnitudes X and Y, but once you've got them, is there any conceivable expertise that would bear on that question? And if so, what would be the characteristics of that kind of expert? And that takes the third question now. Even if you conclude that expertise in principle is possible, how do you identify the experts and then identify the right experts from within the larger class of experts? This is something that is well trod in the literature on expert witnesses. A really, really smart guy, Scott Brewer at Harvard Law School, wrote a 100-page law review article 2 decades ago talking about what a nasty problem that is. Sometimes that decision process can be shaped by results. If you've got someone who has designed 100 bridges and they're all standing still, you might have some reason to think that they know what they're doing about bridge building. So in certain contexts, you can have identifiable markers of successful application of expertise, but in other contexts, that's much harder to do. There are no obvious markers. Or the relationship between expertise and those markers is more ambiguous. And in those circumstances, you're looking for proxies for results, and proxies for results are very difficult to find. As anyone who's had any association with academia can verify, credentials are often a terrible proxy for expertise, particularly when there is no set of results that you can use as a barometer. Fourth problem, how do you know whether the experts that you have picked, assuming that you've picked them correctly, are actually applying their expertise to the problem in hand rather than using their positions to advance some other agenda? How does a non-expert identify instances when experts are applying expertise rather than hiding behind it? Again, this is a well-worn problem. Jurors try to figure out which expert witnesses to believe. Non-expert judges and their non-expert law clerks try to figure out what non-expert agencies are up to. Sometimes they do a good job of it. Sometimes they do a bad job of it. I don't know of anyone who has a good theory about how to make it all work. And finally, the fifth problem may be the most difficult of all. Bear with me on this one. It's a little bit meta. Assume that you have identified a gap in your own knowledge that pertains to a particular problem, and you reasonably concluded that expertise can bear on it, and that you identified the right experts, and that you trust those experts conscientiously to apply their expertise. It's as good a circumstance as you possibly can be. Isn't it obvious in that situation, right, that the experts are going to make better decisions? And here by better, I mean nothing more than more in accordance with the facts of reality. Well, unfortunately, it is not at all clear that that is true even under the best of circumstances because of the ubiquitous but oft ignored problem of second best. Here's what I mean by that. If the additional knowledge brought to a problem by an expert represents the absolute universal sum total of knowledge that bears on that problem, well, yeah, then an expert doing their job will get you to a better answer. But that's like never going to be true, right? You're never going to have the optimal evidence set. Isn't it a lot more likely that expertise properly employed will produce a marginal increase in the quality or quantity of the evidence set, but it's still going to be incomplete? And if that's so, the question is whether a larger evidence set or a better evidence set necessarily leads to better decisions. And unfortunately, the answer as a matter of basic epistemology is it might or might not. We simply don't know. right? You'd need to know the path of knowledge to the correct answer. If it's linear, yeah, maybe every single increment of additional information leads to a better decision. What if it looks like, well, if you happen to be in one of the dips, well, yeah, if you use the experts long enough for 3,000 years, maybe they'll eventually get you to the equilibrium point. But if you happen to be in one of the dips, relying on the experts will actually lead in that moment, at that point on the margin, to a worse decision than the deplorables would reach on their own. Now, none of this means that more knowledge is a bad thing. None of this means that reliance on expertise is never a good thing. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. The point is only that it's a much, much more complicated problem than I think people generally recognize. And slogans are no substitute for serious thinking and a good dose of common sense. All right, so with those thoughts, I'm going to say that attendees who want to be in the queue, if you're on Zoom, use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you're on a telephone, *9 is the window into the queue. But before we get to those questions, I'm just going to give the panelists an opportunity to reflect briefly on what has been said thus far. So let me just go back in order and start with Lisa.
So all of those comments were so interesting. I really appreciate them. And I agree with lots of what was said. I would be really curious, Boyd, to hear your reflections about Operation Warp Speed and about the drive to speed up the vaccine process, because I think it sort of is a microcosm of what you're talking about, where we're kind of picking losers and winners, and whether we're doing so on a good basis or not, or on agency capture, I think is a really important question. I'm also really interested in both of what Dan and Gary said, in part because anecdotally, sort of my experience interacting with people, and obviously anecdotes are not evidence, on these kind of issues, is I've actually encountered a lot of disdain for expertise, both disdain for medical expertise and disdain for legal expertise. And everyone's suddenly a constitutional law expert about what's constitutional and not, at least on Facebook, and an epidemiologist about how likely things are to spread. So I'm interested, Gary, in how you think about that, if that just doesn't sort of reflect, if that reflects some instinct that people have that kind of is lining up with what you're saying about what the limits of expertise and decision making really are, or if there's some other phenomenon at work there. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
All right, Boyd, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I would just simply say that that I think the comments about the congressional abdication or being AWOL is fits. You know, I mean, it's the cause. It's the cause of what I was talking about. Their failure to oversee, to provide the detail on an ongoing basis, which they should be doing, and turning it all over to the experts to combine together as untouchable bureaucrats to limit competition and open debate. And I think the question you raised about expertise would best be answered by just simply more competition, less concentration based on the fact that so much has been vested in these career bureaucrats, and that it should be more open. Just one final observation about testing and vaccines and whatnot. Some of the most important medical advances have come from what's known as off-label use. That is a drug that's approved for one reason, but turns out to be more important for other reasons. And that's the open marketplace of doctors and practitioners and academics and government regulators to work in an open, competitive environment, very transparent, to come up with drugs that or you know, devices or treatments that no bureaucrat invented and no big business solved.
Dan, you want to chime in?
Sure. Two quick things. One is I just want to echo, put an exclamation point on a comment that Boyden made, and I wish I had made it, which is conversations about congressional failure are against the backdrop of some other larger institutional failures. One might be the reticence, different topic for another day, the reticence of the court to impose delegation doctrine-like limits, right, on the actions and the authority of Congress. And second, of course, the complicated question of how courts do or do not police the behavior of regulatory agencies, right? The larger questions of administrative law, which, as Boyden pointed out, loom large in these discussions and the debates. But on the expertise, I want to throw a couple questions at you, Gary, quickly, just as I was thinking about your conversations about expertise. One has to do with, I'll make this assertion, that expertise cannot help us to resolve the vexing question of lives versus livelihood trade-offs, right? We have experience at putting an economic value on human life. We have an experience, of course, of expertise helping us in terms of economic consequences. But all of these risk trade-offs entail fundamental choices about how much contagion and how many deaths are tolerable, right, with respect to this risk trade-offs. I wonder, that's a softball. The second one has to do with this interesting thing you read about in the media about mask wearing, right? I'm struck by the fact, whatever one thinks about the expertise with respect to that, the extraordinary disjunction between what Republicans, to speak broadly, believe about mask wearing and, in fact, how they behave, and Democrats believe about mask wearing is sort of depressing at a meta level. But I wonder whether that tracks any of your thinking about expertise or the lack of expertise.
Well, I mean, there are people who spend their lives studying the sociology of expertise. I'm not one of them. I don't follow that literature more than casually, so I don't want to make any grand pronouncements about what drives people to do anything. I'll just offer this speculation. There have been certain contexts in which expertise has proved very successful, proved by virtue of results. That obviously creates incentives for other people in different fields to try to cloak themselves in that mantle, where there are not such obvious markers of success and failure. And I suspect, guess, with no knowledge whatsoever in the subject, that there are a lot of people who sense that they're being snookered. And over a large range of questions, they may very well be correct. And this is the problem, that the Gresham's law problem of not being able, if you're a non-expert, to distinguish the real experts from the frauds, phonies, and hacks who, Sturgeon's law, 90% of everything is crap. 90% of expertise probably isn't. But how do you know, if you're not an expert, which of the ones to trust? So there's a huge problem of reliability, and in many circumstances, no obvious marker of that. So I don't have an answer to any of this. I'm just Socrates here, poking and being a gad.
Okay, but if I may, you're the moderator, so if this is out of order, but that seems to draw along political lines, which is why I raised the question of mask wearing. It's not just the general public's reticence about expertise. It's Republicans behaving differently than Democrats with respect to an issue that is arguably one in which expertise is reflected.
This is pure speculation. I have no basis for saying this. My guess is that a lot of Democrats think that the experts, or the people who claim to be experts, are on their side. And anyone who takes even the quickest look at the academy, which is where the credentials that often serve as the proxy for expertise are talking about, they're right. As we say, communism exists in three places. It exists in Cuba, North Korea, and American campuses. And again, that's not an unreasonable response. If what you're doing is associate, in other words, the association is not so much mask wearing versus not mask wearing, is who is it that's laying the claim to expertise? And if there's a political valence, an ideological valence to that, as I think there obviously is, well, of course, people are going to think they're being snookered. And as I say, good portion of the time, they're absolutely right. All right. Anyway, I have one question for Lisa, if I may. Having just declaimed on expertise, I have zero expertise in tort law, but of course, being a law professor, that doesn't stop me from saying anything. Some of your comments brought to mind some of the universal problems in tort law, which is, when does it make sense to make guaranteed 100% upfront payments, bear costs, in order to guard against theoretical, possibly remote future probabilities? And I wonder if disaster preparedness poses some of those same concerns. You're 100% guaranteed to bear the upfront costs if you bear them, and you don't know ex ante how likely it is that those will prove necessary. I'm not aware that there's any really good general answer to that in human affairs, and I'm wondering if we have a good general answer to that in the context of disaster preparedness. Again, ex ante rather than ex post.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think so, right? It's hard to know how to think about these questions that are so uncertain. And as we think about risk, I mean, we have sort of models in other fields. We could think about a precautionary principle, right? We're sort of exercising some risk aversion against worst case scenarios, or we could be trying to do cost benefit analysis, but in the face of a lot of uncertainty, that can be pretty difficult, right? We don't always know how likely it is that a certain sort of disaster is going to happen. And so I think the problem of how we confront and think about risk is really no different in disaster law than in any other realm, except that we have more like low probability, high consequence kind of disasters with more uncertainty around them. And so in some ways, it's those problems kind of magnified and on steroids for sure. And I don't know that we have any sort of agreed upon or maybe even yet any kind of sensible way worked out to think about those things, except that I do think we have a tendency to underinvest in preparedness for a number of reasons. One is it's really hard to kind of claim political credit for disasters that were averted and lives that were saved. So it's hard to sort of build the political will around doing disaster preparedness. There's also a lot that suggests that in the way humans think about risk, we're going to downplay at least certain kinds of disaster risk. Natural disasters might be taken less seriously than man-made disasters and terrorism for a variety of those kind of reasons. So I think we have some good reasons to think that we have underinvestment, that sort of we have a paradox around preparedness, in part because the investments that are made by politicians might pay off in the very long term. And so the cycle of political accountability for things that are being paid for now is very different than the cycle of disasters. And so I would tend to think that overall we kind of have a bias toward underpreparedness for lots of kinds of disasters, not necessarily for all kinds of disasters. So I don't have sort of an overall framework in which it's easy to say, here's what we ought to do in the face of a lot of uncertainty, except I have sort of a baseline sense that underpreparedness tends to be the norm.
All right, any more panel comments before I go to the questions from the attendees? 3, 2, 1. Hearing none. Looks like the first question is Eric Rasmussen. Professor?
Looks like he's on mute.
Professor is on mute.
I'm sorry. Could you see me too? No. Anyway, for Boyden and Lisa, mainly, I think everybody except maybe Boyden agrees that Trump messed up, and he might agree by the end of my question. But that's because he played it straight. He let HHS and CDC and FDA heads run things, and they trusted their experts and their civil servants, and that was a disaster. And only when Trump put Pence in charge and basically spanked the CDC and took them out of the picture did anything start happening. So I would any of you deny Trump made a big mistake in leadership, but the mistake was in letting the nonpartisan civil servants run things instead of running roughshod over them sooner than he did. He followed swamp rules and he got swamp speed, and he's a president supposed to do better than that.
Well, if you're asking me, I agree with you. I'm not trying to exonerate Trump by saying that the CDC and the FDA were messing up badly. Trump should have known, and people around him should have known, since they know about this problem of the administrative state, or should know about this problem, that they were going to have this problem in spades right here and now, or back then. And I don't think that, frankly, this is self-serving, but I don't think Reagan would have let that many weeks go by without saying, where are the tests? I just don't believe that would have happened, and I think he would have shaken things up. And I don't think George H.W. Bush would have let that kind of thing happen. So I'm not trying to let Trump off the hook for being asleep at the switch, but I am saying that the core of the problem is one that he inherited, not his fault, which is this aimless delegation of authority to these so-called expert bureaucrats who answer to no one and do not respond to normal, everyday market pressures that apply to most people trying to better their own lives in the best way they can. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing at all. I'm just saying that it's a problem that he should have foreseen, but it is one that he didn't cause. He inherited.
Lisa, did you want to chime in?
Sure. So, without discounting the regulatory problems and the problems at FDA and CDC, which I think are many, I would also place blame at President Trump's feet, in part because I think he didn't see the slow movingness because he didn't want to. I think there was a competing narrative that he had going that this was not going to be that big a deal, that the consequences were not going to be that high, that it was going to pass quickly, that there weren't going to be that many US deaths. And so that was the mindset that he was bringing to the decisions at the top. So I don't think it was just a matter of him being asleep at the switch. I think it was a matter of him making an affirmative decision that it was more in his political interest to try to sort of hope that the disaster wasn't going to be as bad as some of the indications suggested, and not to take measures that would have earlier on sort of resulted in shutdowns or more investment in other areas. So I don't think it's a matter of just regulatory kind of failure. I think it's a leadership failure, not just in kicking the CDC and other things into gear, but in sort of deciding how seriously we were going to take this problem in the first instance.
Can I just jump in? I know it was directed to me.
Absolutely.
That's not a historical matter. That happened this morning. This morning, President Trump said, we're basically just dealing with the ashes of the COVID-19 crisis. So he continues to mess up on that dimension every single day. So tomorrow's a new day. Maybe he'll walk back from that.
I agree with that as well.
All right, I'm sure I'm going to get this next name wrong, so forgive me. Is it Chase Vinci?
It's Chaz Vinci, and thank you for taking my question. So it seems as though President Trump's team of lawyers, I guess you can call them experts, has carved out a sort of new theory of presidential authority, I think, essentially expanding upon the unitary executive, which reigned under George W. Bush and Obama. He's argued in the past that the president has absolute executive immunity in any criminal case brought against him, going so far as to state that even if he murdered somebody in the middle of the street, he would be immune from any criminal proceeding due to the power vested in the executive. How is the theory of executive authority changing in the midst of this crisis, and how will that impact the rule of law?
Who wants to go first?
I want to listen to Boyden.
Okay.
Or Gary, I want to listen to others than me.
I mean, I'll take it. I mean, my understanding is that the killing someone was a joke. I know sometimes there's a Gresham's law with Trump as well. It's hard to tell when he's joking and when he's serious. That one I'm pretty confident was a joke. But the substantive point is a very important one. Executive power today at the federal level would have been unrecognizable in the late 18th century. That is not a new phenomenon. It's not something that started in recent years. I'm not even sure it's accelerated that much in recent years. It certainly hasn't shrunk. I would actually think it's interesting that in this particular crisis, most of the authority, and this came up in the last panel, I don't know how many people were here from that, has been exercised at the state level. That is, the federal role in this has been relatively modest, and indeed, if there are criticisms, it's that the executive hasn't been doing enough, which doesn't really fit the growing imperial presidency model. Nonetheless, I think the premise behind the question is correct in the sense that executive power is out of control. A large portion of that, I think, comes from Dan Rodriguez's talk. Executive is out of control because Congress wants it that way and has wanted it that way for a very long time. Congress didn't want to delegate power to the executive. It could pass statutes. It chooses not to do so. Or when it passes statutes, they're vapid, empty, go forth and do something so we can yell about it later if we don't want it. I think Dan is absolutely right that there's a vacuum. Government power abhors a vacuum, and someone will fill it. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
Here. I'd say if this was the Larrabee article, Gary, there'd be a footnote saying CEG, the steel seizure, which was in the Truman administration. It was long before W. Bush et al.
All right, the next question is Stefan Landsman, professor.
Thank you very much. I wanted to take exception to your framing, Professor Lawson. I don't think the issue is about expertise, but it's about having data or not having data. And those who respect data and use data effectively are the people we ought to be trusting to make decisions. It's not always clear who they're going to be or who's got the right data, but that's why we have continuation of experiment and we demand progress on that front. I think when you frame it as experts, it's people. And I think it's information that really is at the heart of things. And I think that you've skewed it in a way that makes it, I think, troublesome. If you look at the adversary system, with Daubert and so forth, we screen, we then allow adversaries to clash, and then we make common sense decisions. That's not bad, but it's the best we can do in terms of generating data. Even Vice President Pence, when he was in Indiana, was guided by data with respect to needle exchanges. And that was outside of doctrine, but it was about experts generating good data that could then make good decisions. But that's where the heart of it is, not in expertise, but in data.
Well, the only thing I will say is there's data and there's data. And there's always lots of data. And you have the same Gresham's law problem with data as you do with expertise. Really good data gets you good results. Really bad data gets you bad results. The question is how a normal person, a non-expert, either in data gathering, analysis, or management, can tell good data from bad data. That's the problem.
It's the empirical method.
I agree. Where you can actually have results, where you have certain kinds of things where relying on this data gives you measurable results and you can see that the results work. That's the circumstance in which reliance on expertise, the data and the expertise that produces it and analyzes it makes the most sense. But it's very hard to identify ex ante that that's what you're dealing with. Usually that only happens ex post. That's the conundrum. Again, to which I have no brilliant answer. But I don't think going from expertise to data solves the problem. I think it just moves it one step earlier. Anyone else want to take that one?
I would just add this, Gary, if I may. This is an analogy, I'd say, not a truth, but we're sticking with the scientific method. We're going through a period now of natural experiments. They may be tragic natural experiments, but they are natural experiments as well. We didn't see that in the lockdowns much because every state did it more or less. But now with reopenings and phase reopenings, we're going to have some data. And the question is how we utilize that data to find out what worked, what didn't work so well, in order to provide guideposts to what we can do going forward.
Let me just jump in here and say that if you again look at the question, all right, so what treatment might be helpful, which I think is key to all this, because people aren't going to go back to work if they don't have some sense that they're not going to end up in the hospital. I think people would endure some discomfort, but not some of the risks that they're obviously facing. That's a data question, and there's a lot of manipulation of that data, and that's what bothers me about the deep administrative state is the holders of the data are in many cases, in my belief, manipulating the data very badly.
All right, I'm going to get this name wrong too, but I'll try anyway. Michael Ukrin?
Yes, that's Ukraine. Very close, Professor Lawson. Thank you. So my question had to do with what you believe the role of mission creep within the CDC and FDA may have been in its lack of preparedness and unwillingness to adopt testing available abroad with the whole vaping crisis that the CDC has been on in recent months. Has the tendency of an agency to justify its budget through expanding its mission roles play some form of role in its inadequacy to deal with the task that it is designed and intended to perform? Probably a weirdly phrased question, but
I'll give a quick answer. I think you're quite right about mission creep. I think a lot of agencies take the ambiguities and the zeros out of Congress as a authorization to go off on a toot of their own and not stick to their knitting. I think that's very much a problem.
And at least some of the comments you made would bear on that as well. I think that diffusion of authority promotes that kind of lack of focus on particular missions. I wonder if a lesson for designers of the regulatory state, if a regulatory state one must have, should therefore be focusing on narrowing rather than broadening the missions of particular agencies. The counter to that, I'll throw out and then go to the next question, is at least part of the problems that this conference as a whole is dealing with is the narrowing of focus by some people, that problems don't present themselves as just epidemiological problems or just as economic problems or just as banking regulation problems. They present themselves as problems with a lot of, and so it may be harder to draw on different perspectives if you've focused an agency too narrow. So one person's mission creep may be another's, well, we're taking a broader look at the problem. Again, don't have an answer to that. All right, if I get this next name wrong, I'm never going to hear the end of it. Ken Masugi.
Hi, Gary. Thanks. You got it right.
I know it was a joke.
Yes, of course it was, but I was in on it. But that actually leads into my observation. You may be exaggerating the point concerning expertise, because a great number of the deaths in our crisis didn't require any expertise to recognize. I volunteer, or I used to, at a senior center. And every flu season, we lost people. And so it was obvious that given the flu-like nature of this disease, that the assisted living centers were going to be struck horribly. And they were. And it's that disastrous handling that I think could have prevented maybe half the deaths. Regardless of whether we have disagreements about expertise, a great number of the deaths could have been prevented just through common knowledge. There's another example, say the Legionnaire's disease. And that has something to do with ventilation. And so we know, for example, that the New York subways are going to create a crisis. And so we could have isolated just through common sense and not any expertise, a great source of our recent miseries.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that Sturgeon's law is universal. It's not just that 90% of claimed expertise is crap. It's also 90% of non-expert judgment is probably crap as well. Or put it another way, anything that can be done poorly. So to raise questions about the easy reliance on expertise is not to say that non-experts are going to get it right. Lots of times they won't. Lots of times I won't. Would I apply Sturgeon's law to myself? Of course I would. It's self-referential as well. So none of this is to say that first thing is let's kill all the experts. That doesn't follow. It's just that you want to be wary of the philosopher king is all. And the tendency of the last century and a half has been to elevate a particular group of people, identified more by their credentials and class than anything else, as the modern equivalent of the philosopher kings. And that probably requires a lot more careful thought than I think some people and some websites are giving it. That's all. Nothing more than that.
I just want to add that I think one of the roles of expertise, though, is learning from past disasters. And I think Ken's point also points to one of the disaster lessons that we have a hard time learning, which is really about the effect on vulnerable populations. And we often come to a disaster with this kind of mindset that rain falls on the rich and poor alike, that we're all in the same boat together. And almost all past disasters teach us that that is not, in fact, the case, and that there were going to be predictable patterns in those who were going to be most affected by this disaster, among the elderly, among those with pre-existing conditions, among those in minority communities who have poorer access to health care, and where those pre-existing conditions are therefore more prevalent and not as well treated. And so a lot of the patterns we see now are patterns that expertise in the form of attention to what we should have learned from past disasters would have taught us if we had been paying attention. And that might have gone some distance in thinking, in helping our thinking about where we ought to have concentrated resources and the kind of problems we should have been looking for really from the beginning of this crisis.
Actually, go ahead, Brian.
Let me add just one quick thing as a continuation of a data point. I think that there were probably lots of people who knew about the vulnerability of the nursing home situation, who knew about the vulnerability of people of my generation very early on, and didn't want to bifurcate the treatment, which could have been done, I think, very simply. And so it's the data. People just withheld the data from the knowledge of the general public. I think if the public had understood that quicker, there would have been a quicker response. So to me, it's a data thing, and I think it was manipulated. I'm sorry, but I think so.
No, I mean, Lisa's absolutely right that there are going to be differential impacts to all of those things. The point actually came up in a slightly different context earlier today in a different panel. I think it was Jason Johnston who raised the point that not only does the disaster itself possibly have differential impact, but responses do as well. The shutdown response has not equally affected law professors and restaurant workers. It hasn't. Absolutely, I know Lisa has done some writing on this, and I commend it to people. This is one more dimension of the problem that needs to be considered carefully. And it's extremely unlikely that any single person or even small group of people is likely to be able to assemble the necessary knowledge to be able to address all of these different aspects.
Gary, can I intervene again? Can I intervene
again? By all means.
I have a need to leave to go to another meeting, and so I have to exit this wonderful panel with great regret because it's been very edifying, and I've learned as much from this panel as I have from any panel that the Federalist Society has put on. So I'm sorry that I have to leave, and thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being here, Boyd.
Feelings mutual.
Well, let me ask Elise another question, if I can. If you were to propose legislation to Congress that would address some of Dan's concerns, what would that legislation look like? What kinds of statutes do you think it would be a good idea for Congress to enact? I mean, you now control the you've taken over the minds of everyone. You get to write the law. What would it look like?
Yeah, that's a really good and interesting question, which I should spend some more time thinking about. I mean, I think in some ways it's a little bit too early to know what all the cures ought to be, right? I mean, it's clearly the case that pandemics don't fit neatly into the existing disaster response structure, right? That's part of the reason that there was uncertainty with the Stafford Act. Congress had tried to amend it a bunch of times to add public health emergencies that had never passed. And so it wasn't clear that that whole framework even applied. And lots of people originally thought that it didn't. The idea that we don't have any way to declare sort of a nationwide disaster that fits neatly within the way we normally think about the way the Stafford Act works is a really interesting question. And I think part of what it points to is a continuing difficulty that we've had in the federal system of figuring out how to have more proactive federal response in large disasters that affect a lot of states, or particularly in nationwide disasters. And it was one of the things that I kind of tried to fix a little bit after Katrina, but I'm not sure we've yet sort of created a structure that really works for that. I don't know that the Stafford Act emergency declaration structure is really effective from that. So I think there's going to be a lot of learning that ought to happen from this. I do think that the transparency aspect of it is something that we ought to be paying more attention to, because there is always going to be a lot of discretion that's handed over to the president, both because we need some of that. We need someone who can act quickly in disasters. And because, as Dan points out, there's good reasons Congress is anxious for political reasons and otherwise to sort of have the executive do a lot of the responding. And we're always going to have that large element of discretion, I think. And so finding ways to cabin that and to at least have some transparency around what's happening. And it's really hard, even for people who have a pretty good sense of what the federal emergency structure looks like, to figure out what's happening with Operation Warp Speed. What powers are being invoked by the president to do that? Is it kind of fitting in between these existing authorities? And so I do think there needs to be more clarity and maybe more more thinking about what pandemic specific powers ought to look like and how it fits within the scheme, as well as more thinking around what transparency can and should look like in this context. And it's certainly not a cure-all, but it is one of the things that we have as a tool to potentially check discretion, which I think is really important.
Dan, not going to do it?
Yeah, can I flip your question around, Gary, and give some quick advice about what not to do? I think we've seen in modern American history reactions to particular crises that have led us to very ill-suited and ill-fated legislation. We go back to the National Recovery Act as ancient history, but think about war powers and the War Powers Act in the wake of Vietnam, the Patriot Act, and other statutes enacted right in the teeth of 9/11, and even Dodd-Frank, as Boyden was mentioning. And those examples I think or the Independent Counsel Act, certainly. Those don't shower ourselves in glory, meaning Congress. And I think that the methodical, it's maybe this is naive, but there has to be enough distance, bipartisan distance from the heat of the white heat of the pandemic to really enable us to look at these issues, so we don't, in my view, replicate our errors with some of these statutes that you can see a thread, right, were enacted because we had to do something, and then the something that we did turned out to be, I won't say the cure was worse than the disease, but tended to be seriously problematic, both from a constitutional perspective, but also from a public policy perspective. I hope we don't do that.
I think we can sneak in one more question, and it will come from Gene Meyer.
Needs to take himself off.
Who is muted?
I just realized that. Thanks. I was wondering, one of the problems that seems to exist in the discussion is that there's this question about, well, trade-off of the economic damage versus damage in lives. And part of what strikes me there is that that's not necessarily the right way to look at it, in the sense that the damage in lives, the economic damage is going to cause a lot of the damage in lives too. And I think that point's certainly been brought up before. I don't know if it's been stressed as much as I'd like, but my question is more, how does what goes into the framing of what the question is on these sorts of things? Because once you frame it as lives versus economics, you probably predetermine most of the results and justify most of the actions. I'm not even arguing for this purpose the actions weren't justified, but once you have that structure, that's where you're gonna go.
Sure.
Any thoughts on that?
So I'll jump in on this. This bears on what we've all been talking about. Be interested in Gary's reaction from the vantage point of expertise. I think that's an excellent point, both the example you raise and the larger phenomenon. I think we see a tension there between, I won't say expertise, but a certain rational assessment of issues that we can appreciate are straddle the fence between economic and health ones. And I think the example is exactly right. There are measurable impacts on human lives and well-being that come from lockdowns, from economic consequences. But those seem to be very hard. They're not tractable in public opinion. It's not a point about deplorables, to use Gary's phrase. I think it's, again, human nature, social psychology. It's hard to see that connection. It's not as palpable and meaningful. And so politicians, political officials, shy away from making just those points because they find it, not within the wheelhouse, as it were, of their political judgments. I don't think there's an answer by any means. I don't think the courts are an answer to that in any significant way, or administrative agencies. But it's about public rhetoric, and I think it really behooves our leaders, our leadership from the executive branch on down, to really be thinking about articulating in a tractable but nuanced way how these issues arise. These are public health issues, but public health is a very big tent that includes economic considerations, distributed situations, circumstances, as Lisa was saying, that require really the use of the bully pulpit to communicate exactly what those trade-offs and what those issues are about. And we've seen examples in American history of leadership doing that, but I think that's really what this pandemic calls for, just as you say.
All right, I'll throw in one more obnoxious comment. In my very limited experience, schools of public health are among the most politicized units in universities. which probably does not bode well for how well received their advice is likely to be on matters of public health. I would also recommend anyone who tuned in late to this conference to go back and watch the first panel, because some of these same issues about trade-offs between measurable lives and economic consequences, which can also be translated into measurable lives if you use an appropriate methodology, was a topic of conversation.
I'll just add, I mean, I find the polarization of the rhetoric to be really sad and disturbing in some respects, right? That we've sort of created these kind of camps where we're pitting lives against the economy, or we're talking about mask wearing as infringements on constitutional rights. And I don't know that if it was inevitable that mask wearing, for example, would get as politicized as it has. But I do think we need to figure out ways to talk to each other better about these kind of issues instead of being so polarized on all of these kinds of things. I don't know what the solution is to that. It's discouraging that this is where we are, that we can't have conversations around these really important questions of framing and thinking about trade-offs, which are also compounded by uncertainty, right? It's not like we knew how many lives were going to be saved by the shutdown. How do we think about those questions as a society? And I don't really feel like we're digging into those questions so much as we are sort of throwing rhetoric back and forth at each other.
Yeah.
And that's probably a good place to end today's proceedings. Gene, what do you think? That's a good thought to end on. You're still muted.
Yes, I know. I did it again. I think that is a good place to end. I want to thank all of you very much. For our audience, we will resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with our fourth panel, which is on basically election law and how that mixes in with COVID, or COVID and elections. So thank you all for your participation, and for the audience, hope to see you back tomorrow morning.
Great. Thank you for doing this. To
Thank
the
you.
FedSoc for doing this.
Thank you.